You've seen this weapon 1,000 times, mounted on tanks, jeeps, helicopters, and bombers in just about every American war film ever made. It is a hunk of steel that has become the very silhouette of American hard power. It's over 100 years old now, virtually unchanged since 1918. With roughly 2 million produced during World War II alone, it is the most produced heavy machine gun in human history. But have you ever stopped to ask yourself what life was actually like for the men whose entire existence narrowed down to the space behind those spade grips? If the answer is yes, you're about to find out, and the reality is a lot darker, colder, and more violent than the Hollywood version suggests. The story of the M2.50 caliber gunner isn't just a story of a gun. It's a story of men being asked to do the impossible while standing in the most exposed spot on the battlefield. Imagine for a second you are 20 years old, suspended in a plexiglass bubble underneath the belly of a B-17 bomber. You are 5 miles above the earth. The temperature is 60 degrees below zero, and your breath is freezing into ice crystals inside your oxygen mask. You are curled into a fetal position because the space is only 44 inches wide. You can't wear a parachute because it won't fit. Below you is nothing but thin air and the entire German Luftwaffe. To your left and right are two M2 Browning machine guns. When they fire, the vibration rattles your teeth so hard you think they might crack. This was the daily reality for thousands of men, and for many of them, that tiny glass ball became their coffin. We like to talk about the Deuce as a legend, but for the guys pulling the trigger, it was a heavy, temperamental, and often terrifying burden. The M2 exists because of a very specific nightmare encountered during the First World War. General John Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Force, was watching his troops get shredded by German ground attack aircraft. These planes were starting to carry armor plating that simply shrugged off standard .30 caliber rifle rounds. The bullets were bouncing off like pebbles. Pershing realized that if the Americans didn't get something with more punch, they were going to lose the sky and the ground. In July 1917, he sent a frantic request back home. He needed a new weapon with a caliber of at least half an inch and a muzzle velocity exceeding 2,700 feet per second. This was a massive jump from anything that existed. He went to the one man who could solve the problem, John Moses Browning. Browning didn't reinvent the wheel. He just made the wheel bigger and much more lethal. He took his proven M1917 water-cooled design and scaled every single part up to fire a massive new cartridge. That round became the .50 BMG, the .50 Browning machine gun. It was essentially a scaled-up .30-06 rifle round, but with the added kick of some captured German anti-tank technology. They didn't know it at the time, but they had just birthed one of the most effective cartridges in military history. On October 15, 1918, the first prototype was tested. Full trials occurred exactly 1 week after the armistice. The war was over, and suddenly, this terrifying new weapon had nowhere to go. For nearly 20 years, the gun looked like it might be a total disaster. The military didn't know what to do with it. The original water-cooled version weighed a ridiculous 121 pounds. If you wanted to move it, you needed a team of men and a lot of luck. It could only feed ammunition from the left side, which made it impossible to mount in tight spots like tank turrets or aircraft wings. Even worse, when they tried to make an air-cooled version to save weight, the barrel got so hot it would literally fracture after only 75 rounds. It was too heavy for infantry, too slow for planes, and too clunky for tanks. Throughout the 1920s, the M2 was a ghost, relegated to coastal defense and forgotten by the public. Browning himself passed away in 1926, never seeing his greatest creation reach its potential. The breakthrough finally came in the early 1930s. Engineers developed a universal receiver that allowed the gun to feed from either the left or the right, and they finally created the heavy barrel, or HB variant. This changed everything. By 1933, the M2HB weighed 84 pounds and could reach out and touch someone over 2,000 yards away. To understand the power of this thing, you have to look at the physics. The .50 BMG delivers between 10,000 and 15,000 foot-pounds of energy. That is 4 times the power of the standard infantry rifle of the time, and nearly 30 times the power of the pistols and submachine gun soldiers carried. It didn't just hit targets, it deleted them. It could punch through an inch of hardened steel armor from 100 yards away. When World War II finally erupted, the M2 was ready, and it started its legendary run in the freezing skies over Europe. If you want to understand the true price of being a .50 cal gunner, you have to look at the American heavy bombers. The B-17 Flying Fortress was designed to be a porcupine of steel. It carried 13 M2 machine guns. Out of a 10-man crew, the majority were gunners. Their job was to stand in unpressurized, open windows while German fighters screamed toward them at 400 miles per hour. These aircraft guns were different from the ones on the ground. They were tuned up to fire 800 or even 1,200 rounds per minute because in a dogfight, you only have a split-second window to hit your target. But there was a catch. The air at 30,000 feet is a killer. The waist gunners stood at open hatches where the wind blast was so violent it caused over half of all frostbite cases in the Air Force. If your gun jammed, and they did jam, and you made the mistake of pulling off your heated glove to fix it, your bare skin would freeze to the metal receiver instantly. Men lost fingers to the M2 before they ever saw a German fighter. And the casualty rates were staggering. The waist gunner positions took about 20% of all hits on the aircraft. You were essentially standing in a doorway holding a heavy machine gun, while the enemy used 20mm cannons to try and saw your plane in half. Then, there was the aforementioned ball turret. It is hard to overstate the psychological toll of that position. You were isolated from your crew. You were hanging outside the fuselage. If the landing gear failed, you were the first thing to hit the runway. There are documented accounts of pilots having to make emergency belly landings while knowing their ball turret gunner was trapped inside because the gears had jammed. They would have to talk to the man over the radio, knowing he was about to be crushed, and there was absolutely nothing they could do. That is the darker side of the M2 story. The gun was magnificent, but the cost of operating it in those conditions was a level of trauma that stayed with survivors for the rest of their lives. Down on the ground, the M2 was having a different but equally violent impact. It became the all-purpose answer to every problem the American Army faced. If there was a sniper in a house, you didn't send a squad in. You let the .50 cal chew the house until there was no house left. If a light tank appeared, the .50 cal would shred its optics and tracks. The Germans absolutely hated it. They called it the finger of God, because if a gunner spotted you, you were gone. This led to a grim evolution in tactics. The Germans started prioritizing the gunner above all else. If you were the guy behind the M2 on top of a Sherman tank, you had a giant bullseye on your forehead. The Sherman's M2 was mounted on a pintle behind the turret, meaning to fire it, a crew member had to climb out and stand on the engine deck, completely exposed from the waist up. You were the king of the battlefield for as long as you were alive, which often wasn't very long once the shooting started. This vulnerability is what makes the story of Audie Murphy so insane. In January 1945, Murphy climbed onto a burning, crippled tank destroyer that was loaded with fuel and ammo. He took over the M2 and held off an entire company of German infantry for an hour. He was standing in the open, silhouetted by flames, while 200 men tried to kill him. The only reason he survived was the sheer suppressing power of that .50 caliber barrel. He turned a desperate retreat into a victory, but he did it by becoming a human lightning rod for every bullet in the area. After World War II, the M2 didn't go into a museum. It went to Korea. This was where the Quad 50 became a legend. Imagine 4 M2s mounted on a single powered turret, firing 2,000 rounds per minute. In Korea, the Chinese used human wave attacks, sending thousands of soldiers charging across open ground. Veterans described the Quad 50 as a sickle cutting through wheat. The guns fired so much that the barrels would glow a dull cherry red and actually start to sag toward the ground. The gunners would have to dump water or even snow on the barrels just to keep the metal from melting. It was a meat grinder, pure and simple. By the time Vietnam rolled around, the M2 was being used in ways Browning never imagined. On the rivers of the Mekong Delta, PBR crews fought ambushes at ranges of 30 feet. The gunners were the first ones to draw fire and the first ones to return it. The casualty rate for these crews was astronomical. Nearly 75% of sailors in some units could expect to be wounded or killed during their tour. Meanwhile, on the mountains, guys like Carlos Hathcock were proving the M2 wasn't just a spray and pray weapon. Hathcock attached a high-powered scope to an M2 and used it as a sniper rifle, knocking out a target from 1.5 miles away. It was a record that stood for 35 years, proving that this 1918 design was more accurate than almost any modern rifle of the time. But the most dangerous era for the .50 cal gunner might have been the early days of Iraq and Afghanistan. The Humvee became the primary patrol vehicle, and once again, the gunner was the most exposed person in the convoy. Standing in that turret, you were vulnerable to snipers, grenades dropped from balconies, and the upward blast of IEDs. For years, these men stood there with no protection other than their body armor. It wasn't until the mid-2000s that the military finally standardized armored shields for the turrets, and later, the CROWS system, which allowed the gunner to sit safely inside the vehicle and operate the gun with a joystick and a screen. It took almost a century, but the gunner finally got his head under cover. Today, the M2A1 is the latest version, featuring a quick-change barrel so soldiers don't have to spend precious minutes manually timing and spacing the weapon under fire. It is still the same hunk of steel, still firing that same massive 1918 cartridge, and still the most feared sound on any battlefield. The M2 has outlasted the men who designed it, the men who first fired it, and it will likely outlast many of the vehicles it's mounted on today. It is a masterpiece of engineering, but we should never forget that for 100 years, being an M2 gunner meant being the bravest, coldest, and most targeted person in the room. If you're fascinated by the engineering of the weapons that changed history, would you like me to break down the mechanics of the M2's timing and headspace to show you exactly why this gun was so notoriously difficult and dangerous to maintain in the field?